All right, well, welcome everybody. My name is Sergey Barsky, as Jeff mentioned. I've been doing development and getting paid for it for like 20 years. I didn't know that happened, but apparently happened last year. And so I've been in Microsoft world since 1990 something, 97 or 98. I've been doing ASP.NET for the past maybe like 8 years, give or take, and I've been doing Angular 1 for maybe like 3 or 4. So when Angular 2 came out, I was quite interested in it. And to help me learn, as Jeff mentioned, the best way to learn is to teach. So before I knew what it was, I signed up to teach, because why not? And so I've been working at it for about 14 months. I'm working on a video course for it, so it's gonna help me learn. It's a good way to do it. And today it's gonna be very, very high level overview because there's just not enough time. If we could do like 8 hours, I could do a much better job, but
we've only got 6, so
we're gonna have to cut a few things out based on that. So it's going to be high level overview, but it's going to be mostly code based, but there's going to be a lot of slides too because it's hard to show a lot of code. I won't be coding live because that would slow us down even more. And it's going to be a little bit about ASP.NET Core and Entity Framework, and a bit more about Angular 2. So I pre-built the app and I'll make it available as a download. Hopefully sometime tomorrow, if not then over the weekend. So if you want to look at the code later or the slides, I'll post it all somewhere and I'll let Jeff know and he can share the link on the meetup group. So we already talked a little bit about ASP.NET Core. So what's called MVC, it kind of overlaps both what used to be MVC and Web API. So they kind of merged in ASP.NET Core into single framework where you have only single controller with methods that could serve either views or data. So it kind of merged. So it's a unified API, which makes it a little bit easier to learn. I guess Microsoft was a bit under pressure. So one of the reasons they started that is to make ASP.NET cross-platform because Node is really short. So you gotta compete and they want to stay relevant. So ASP.NET Core is really a .NET or small portion of .NET port to all platforms. So it's a unified API, but it runs on Linux and Windows, and you can develop on Mac, but there is no official way for you to do production on Macs. So, but either Linux or Windows is supported. And we're gonna hit Web API first and maybe EF first. So Web API at a high level is simply HTTP abstraction, which means that its semantics are close to HTTP protocol, meaning you have verbs, and you have body, and you have headers, and you have query strings, and they have an abstraction on top of all that you ordinarily don't need to worry about, and all you do, you write classes and methods, and you decorate these methods or rely on conventions, and Microsoft will automatically intercept HTTP request, parse it out, find the right class to call, then find the right method to call, convert the body of the request or the query string or both into parameters, convert them to the right type, and call your method and pass you whatever was in the request. So ordinarily, as you write code, you technically don't even need to think of it. But it's good to have that in mind as you write in the code. And the idea is that you write code that is also close to that. So maybe rely on some abstractions in your results as well. So controllers, the important part to know about them is that they represent kind of chunks of functionality. Each one can respond to one or more HTTP requests, and each of those requests will map to a method. And the controller is sort of a container, and the only thing that it does is essentially provide some route to all those methods. So you have the way to say whatever browser has in the URL, we're going to look at controllers, we're going to map those chunks of the URL, whatever's between slashes, to whatever the controller is decorated with. We'll look at that in a minute. So the other important part to know that you can have sync or async methods, and async has become a standard. So all the code that is in this demo is all async all the way through. You could write synchronous code, and there could be a legit reason why you want to do that, because they may get you like extra 2 milliseconds in response time, right? Because async code in general is slower than synchronous code, but it scales better. So that's why people write async code. EF, again, is a rewrite. So I guess, I don't know if I've heard the term EF core, but technically that's what EF core is. It's a rewrite of entity framework using .NET Core framework as the quote-unquote language. At a high level, it's really the same. So it has a provider model, so you can run against SQL Server or whatever else, Providers come up, right? They eventually get written. Same thing happened when the EF came out. So when it initially shipped, it was just SQL Server, and that's it. But within a few months, all other RDBMS databases were supported as well. It also ships with provider for Azure tables. I don't know, there's a compelling reason to do it, but they kind of expanded provider model to more than just relational databases. So you could do fancy things like that. And because it's also cross-platform, in theory, on the roadmap, they see things like running it in iOS somehow, maybe writing Xamarin app using EF Core that talks to SQLite instance on iOS device. So there are all kind of possibilities that people are talking about, however, not much happening right this minute. So as far as configuration goes, I'm going to use kind of Fluent API here, but the old annotations are still there. And things are, you can, for example, have a property, say name, and you want it to be not nullable in database, you can still put a required attribute on. So data annotations also got ported over, and you can use that. And so we're going to start looking at the code for a little while. Shoot.
On the web API, does it support fetch natively? How does it handle fetch?
Fetch meaning?
When the Angular sends a HTTP fetch action, I guess it converts to get and post?
It's all GET. Like Angular is at the core also sits very close to HTTP protocol, which means you have HTTP verbs. So there's no fetch verb. So you would use get, post, and put delete by default. It also supports options and head, but I've never had like a reason to use either one of those. Just never came out. I'm sure there are valid reasons to use them, but that's what Angular 2 supports.
So Angular 2 didn't switch over to fetch?
No, it's those 6 verbs. 4 main ones plus head and options. So which is, sometimes important if you want to support cores like at some other level. So we're going to start by looking at the project. And you can create a project. I'm not going to do that because I wasn't sure that there's going to be an internet connection. So I set up the project. I'll walk through the steps for 1 second. So just to show the experience. And when you start creating a ASP.NET Core project, I set up new project template, and you pick ASP.NET Core application. And then you have a subsequent screen where you set up some additional settings. So you can have web API, web app meaning it's MVC/web API app. Web API is just data. So you get fewer references, but not far fewer references, because MVC reference now includes both MVC and Web API. So there's not a whole lot of difference between these two. But in here you get some basic MVC layout page, or master page as they used to be called, and a single view controller. So you get a little bit of it pre-built out. And you can specify some Azure hosting options, because that's how we make money. Or by we, I mean Microsoft. So just a friendly reminder as you go through that there is a good hosting option for core, is Azure. So once you set up the project, and we're going to start with MVC, I started with the persons controller. So I built that out. And go over a couple of things that you see here. So one is the route. So I'm kind of sticking to old Web API convention, where your data is kind of separated by prefixing it with API from MVC things, so they don't accidentally fall into the route. Even MVC6 supports the controller, which called like substitute token, and ASP.NET Core will automatically grab the class name, scrub the word controller out of it, and then put that persons into the route for you automatically. So it's kind of a minor thing, but say you're doing refactoring, renaming things, they will just automatically work. You don't have to remap the stuff. But you can also explicitly put persons in here instead, and that'll work too. Now let's flip to Entity Framework for 1 minute. As I mentioned before, it's Entity Framework kind of builds on top of the old EF, which means code first. So to map a class to a table is just, there's nothing to write. It's a plain vanilla class, nothing special in it. Well, when it becomes special, when I wrap it inside the DB context. A DB context is a database abstraction, so to speak. And each table that you have, you expose through DB, through your context API to consuming code. In this case, I have one table. I'll call it persons, and it consists of a collection of persons. So now what this means, just to recap, I have a database, whatever I'm going to call it. It has one table in it. And if I want to know what columns are in it, I'll look at the class, and the class says I have 2 columns in. So if I'm going to start up SQL, so we can see what that looks like in SQL Server. And on top of that, what I have to do is do configuration. So I could do attributes. I kind of wanted to demonstrate Fluent API a little bit more. It's kind of more explicit, and I'm not sure if everything that is covered in API is exposed through attributes. In the past, that wasn't the case. There were certain things you couldn't configure through attributes. So if I look at that table, it converts pretty cleanly to primary database, one table, persons, and it has 2 columns. And as you can see, name is not nullable, and it's 30 characters long. So how do I do that? It's very similar API to the old EF API, except the body classes or type configuration classes are gone. So it's kind of like pushing that down on you. So if you have one table, I have 4 lines of code. If I have 1,000 tables, I don't want to maintain that method. So it would be good to break it up into like some kind of your own configuration classes. So in this case, all I specify is the primary key. You can use hash key. It'll actually figure things out based on convention. So if I have a property called ID or property called class name plus ID, it'll actually figure it out. But just to demonstrate how to do it, I'm using hash key. And then I configure each property. So this one is SQL Server identity column. So I say it's auto-generated, let it know that it's going to be generated on the server. More interestingly, there is again Fluent API where you can chain methods. So to configure string property, in this case, I'm telling it that it's required and has max length of 30. So what that means is required translates on a database engine to not nullable. If you omit it, nullable types are nullable in database. Not nullable types are not. Question?
Can all that be done by attributes on the actual person's class?
Yes, most things, I would say more than 90%, you can do based on attributes. Yeah, so you can put like a key attribute for here, for example. We can do this just to demonstrate. Required. The only question is, do I have the right namespaces in here? So data annotations are still here. So I could do this, and I think there is a key attribute here as well. Same thing. So what I did is did this part. Required and key, if I wanted to do max length, then there is a max length attribute 30. So this code is equivalent to this code. So whichever way you like, it doesn't really matter.
And you can still do model first and database first, right?
There is a code generation, but I don't know if it supports core yet, but I think you can probably generate the old one. But there is no what I would call old database first. That doesn't exist. So EDMX is gone. So there is no way for you to use that. So it's only code first. You can reverse engineer that code. I haven't tried it in core. It worked in a standard .NET, and it used to generate, depending on which generator you use. Some of them used attributes, some of them used Fluent APIs. I can't say for sure what of it is supported in core. I just haven't tried.
And the migration concept still exists?
Migration concept is still exists. However, how you get to it is slightly different. So while we're on the topic, command line is everywhere in core, just like it's everywhere in Node. Command line is your best friend, including entity framework. So there is a CLI that ships with ASP.NET Core, and the CLI executable name is .NET. So if I wanted to do entity framework, I have to import entity framework commands NuGet package, which we didn't look at project.json. But somewhere in here, I have this entity framework core.tools, which plugs into entity framework. So we haven't talked about project.json. One reason is that it's going away, so I didn't want to spend a ton of time on it. And nobody's 100% sure what replacement is. So I just kind of glassed over it. But if you want to use EF tools, you got to install EF tools. Once you install EF tools, you can type .NET EF. And so all these commands plug into main.NET executable as, I don't know, available kind of commands inside. I don't know how to phrase it. So if I run .NET EF, it's sort of a help page. And it says, well, you can do these specific commands. You can do versions. You can do database. The only interesting things are about it are database, context, and migrations. So then I can type migrations. And then I can get a help page for how to use migrations. Interesting things are there is to add migration and remove migration. Everything else is kind of blah. So your flow would be, you would create your context, you would create your classes, and if you want to use migrations, you would type migrations, add, something like this, initial, or whatever we want to call it. And what that's going to do is scaffold your database and create your migrations. If your database doesn't exist, it's going to create one migration for your database. So initially, so if you do code first kind of development, your database doesn't exist. So when you run add initial migration, there is no database to match. So it's going to scaffold your entire thing. And it would look like this.
Using 2014 Express, was that your database? What were you using as your SQL Server?
I use SQL Server, but you can use Express.
You're using, which?
Developer edition.
Like 2014 or?
It's 2014. But interestingly enough, this is compatible to whatever SQL Server version is supported by Microsoft. So technically, they still support 2008 R2. So they guarantee it'll work against all those versions, and it will also work against SQL Azure as well. So it supports all of them. Because at a high level, they kind of are all the same. So if I type, so these two things are a result of me typing what I just typed in here. .NET EF migrations add initial. And initial is just a migration name. So it built this thing. Snapshot, which is just the initial view of the database. And it's a little bit, I feel like a little bit more cryptic than it used to be. But you can still recognize my person table in here. If you like squint a little, you will find here's my person table, and here's my person ID property, and here's my name property, and it's a table called person. So you squint and you, yeah, it's there. So it's in the snapshot, or what they call snapshot. And then, because the database didn't exist, and it created another initial migration to create a table. So you can do it in pieces. So you can create like your context, create initial migration, and then create new migration, and it'll create a migration for a table, or it'll just create it all in one swoop. So your flow as you develop is, so you create a table, and now you want to say, okay, I want to add a column, or I want to add a table. So what your flow would be, you would write a new class, and you call it a whatever, and then you would run the same command, which is migration.create, and you give it some meaningful migrations add, and you give it some meaningful name, like new table called whatever. Like it's your readability. That's the only thing that matters. And then it would connect to that database. It would see what the differences are based on what it created last time. And it would create another migration, and it would call it whatever I called it. And in that migration, you wouldn't see the person table, you would see whatever table. That's the only thing. And as you run the stuff, it'll look at the database, and it will run all migrations in order that haven't been run. And it will essentially recreate your database for you. Or so is that's the basic goal. So the only other part is how do developers update their local database? So like I've run it, now what? So if we go back and we look at database command, or I don't want to say it's command, it's like command inside command. So there's the F commands, and there's database command inside the F command, and inside database command there is another command, and it's called update. So if you run that, if you type .NET EF whatever I just typed in, database update, that will push into your local instance. How does it know where local instance is? So that specific concept became slightly trickier than it used to be, or at least so I feel. So if you want to enable the developer flow, you have to create another constructor with database context options. And as you run it, as you run EF, that actually runs part of your app. So it actually stands up your app under the covers, looks up in the config file in the code that you wrote for that app, finds the connection string and passes it along. So if I look at the startup.cs and see how I configure entity framework, maybe I should cover this for a minute. So startup.cs is your entry point into ASP.NET Core app. And it typically is broken down into two places outside of startup thing. So startup, it's all convention driven. So if you see here, there's no interface that says I support startup process. There's nothing there. So you sort of kind of know what you need to call things. And you call things called startup is called post constructor, but before your application is run. Typically you don't do much in it. The only thing I do here is digest the configuration file, which in this case it's a appsettings.json file, which is the replacement of web config for the most part. You know, new times, and JSON is much better than XML. You can also have other builders, such as environmental variables builder. Where environmental variables are neat is that you can have the same config file for production and dev, And the only difference is you set different environmental variables. So it enables you to have like a static config file that nobody ever touches. And everything else is environmental variables. Where it's convenient is kind of a developer flow, maybe even production flow. You kind of remove configuration from source control for the most part. It's just not in it. It just kind of resides on the machine you're running this app in. Where it's a little less convenient if you want to have two instances of the same app and you want to have two environmental variables, then it becomes a little bit tricky. So that's that part. So the next part, you need to tell it what services I want to inject. Come back a little bit. ASP.NET Core is all about dependency injection, just like ASP, not ASP.NET Web Forms, but kind of how MVC and Web API used to be. So recommended way, you dependency inject everything. In here, it's the same thing, it's just a little bit more in your face. So the next method is configure services, which is your injection point. So you can say, hey, I have a services collection. I'm going to add some more custom stuff to it that you don't know about. It's sort of kind of similar. You edit NuGet packages. You have a bunch of DLL in a bin folder. And then you want to say, I want to add, in this case, entity MVC as a service. So underneath that, it kind of stands up MVC infrastructure, and it says, now this is available as injectable. And it just kind of understands how to do controllers, how inject things into constructor of my controllers, which I do. So if we flip back a sec, and we're jumping around a bit, so if you guys need me to pause, just let me know. But it kind of flows, right? So we're talking about dependency injection. How does it work? As I add MVC, things like this work. So I can inject my entity framework context into my controller without explicitly doing anything. It's just another injectable. So the advantage of that is, for example, garbage collection. It's automatic because I injected the context into constructor using ASP.NET Core dependency injection. I don't need to dispose. It'll be disposed for me when the request completes. So because that is kind of very convenient way to code things, Entity Framework is another injectable service now, which it really wasn't before. You could probably write a bit of code yourself and make it so, but it is now a quote-unquote service. So Entity Framework is a service that you can inject into ASP.NET Core app question.
Right, and it matters which order you put these things in as you're adding them.
Not in here. Not in here. We haven't gotten to that part yet.
Okay.
Haven't gotten to that part yet. So to add Entity Framework as a quote-unquote service, I add it as Entity Framework, which makes it the whole thing injectable. And then I say, the thing that I want to really inject most of the time is this DB context that I just created. It's called primer context, which is the class. And then I need to tell it how to get connection string from where. So once I do this, this code gets married to this code automatically. There's nothing I need to do. They kind of get mapped together. So as soon as I say this context is available and here's how I'm getting the configuration, this code, and as you see, I didn't have to specify anything, but it just works. So how it gets the connection string is that app settings.json. And if I open it up, you think of app settings.json as an object graph. And as I suck it in through JSON configuration API, like this, it gets flattened out. So if I want this connection string colon default connection mean, find a property called connection strings, and inside there find a property called default connection, and that's what I want to do. So when I run database update, it'll actually compile the app, stand it up, run through startup code, stand up all the injectable, then run my database update. So as a result, you can do database update if you cannot compile the app. And I don't know if you noticed, but when I ran database EF, first thing it did is compiled my app. Because it said, until I compile it, and nothing I can do. So this is your basic flow for doing EF and doing migrations and doing local development. Now jumping back to what Kevin was talking about, we're going to go back to startup. And then there is a next method, which is configure. So that's what Kevin was referring to. So after I inject the services, then I have to configure ASP.NET Core HTTP request handling pipeline. Fancy term is middleware. So in here, your order matters. So when a request comes into ASP.NET Core app, it will be passed into each of the middleware services that I inject here. So if we look at that, first one, I'm configuring the console, which is just a side thing, but it'll just echo stuff to the console, which is not like super useful, right? So then, if an exception occurs in development environment, I want to see ugly yellow screen. It's not yellow anymore; it's like white with a sad blue smiley face. But I see the ugly yellow screen, and in production, I don't want to see that. So hopefully, I will write some other code that will log errors for me. Otherwise, it's going to be rough. And after that, we're going to pipeline. So the first thing that I do is static files. So how do I get static files? It's back to project.json, and it's all about NuGet packages. So I'm adding all NuGet packages that I want to use in my app. One of them is login.console, which you just saw. The next one, I want to do static files. Next one, I want to do MVC. If I want to do MVC pages, not just API, then I have my tech helpers and MVC tools. And then I have my entity framework stuff, which is the core plus the SQL server, which is the provider I want to support. And then I'm replacing, just for giggles, I'm replacing the default container with structure map. And the advantage of that is you write a little bit less code, because if I go back here, say I have like my own, 50 controllers or some other services to register, it's kind of a lot of code, or I can do that. So I can say, scan my directory with default conventions and scan these assemblies. So I'll just write a little bit less code with DI container that is a bit more robust than the one that comes in a box. But if you don't have some advanced scenarios and you don't mind writing some manual configuration code to inject your services, you just don't need to do it. The default container is just fine.
And where do you put the database password?
It'll be in your connection string, just like before. So wherever your connection string is, that doesn't change. Really, the syntax of connection string did not change, because it's really not .NET Core technology. It's a wide, bigger technology of our DBMS. So this syntax is exactly the same. So if I look at app settings JSON, you see that's a pretty familiar connection string. That I don't think that is in the box, but I don't know for sure. But you could probably use, there is definitely an encryption API that is available in ASP.NET Core. I just can't say, I've never used it, but whether it's something that automatically just decrypts connection strings, I don't know if that exists. But you can write your own.
I don't think it exists by default, but I think the new thing with .NET Core is the secrets file.
Yeah.
What did you say, secret file?
Yeah, secrets, no, it's like a concept they call secrets, which is secretly stores your secret in a secret place. So,
What is the name of the container that you use?
structure map. But pretty much all big ones like Ninject, structure map, AutoFac, they all been ported to .NET Core a long time ago in beta version. So I used structure map when ASP.NET Core was in beta like a year ago. It was already ported over. So I kind of got stuck using structure map because I just found that one first. But they all are supported. So if you have your favorite one that you used in Web API or MVC, you can continue using that. At least in structure map, the API is slightly different. I'm going to say that. Certain things are not exactly the same, but certain things are the same. So the key part with this configure services, and again, names matter. It's all convention-driven startup. The only key part here to remember in configure that you build in pipeline. So say you want MVC to handle your request first, you can do that. Or say you have extensive login framework that logs your request, you would put that first. Then you can do static files, you can use MVC, and if you have like a timing framework that says, I want to know how long stuff took, you can plug that, write that as middleware, plug it at the end, it gets passed in, every one of them gets passed in the request and response. So you can look at both and you can do login, you can do whatever you want to do with it. You can do some kind of authorization filters, like possibilities are kind of endless. But you're in charge of the pipeline. So if you remember the old either MVC or web forms, the framework was in charge of the pipeline. You had no say-so when stuff gets invoked in request process in pipeline. Like you can override those methods and do something, but you have no say-so when it happens. Here, that's completely changed, and you're in charge of the request handling pipeline. So it's more responsibility, but it's more power. But for simple use cases, as you can see here, is 2 lines of code. And you don't need to worry about it. Because if all you do is a standard app, all you need really is just static files and MVC. Or static file middleware would handle your like JS and CSS stuff. And then the way it works, if the request is handled, there is a response, then everybody else ignores it. And the response is returned. So this request-response pair just gets passed around.
So you put the authorization into that pipeline?
If you have some custom authorization, yeah, you can do that. And if you do things like identity server, I can't say I've looked into it that much, but I'm sure they have middleware. Because there is no good way for you to do it in .NET Core. You have to write the middleware for all of your custom use cases. So while we're on configuration, there is one thing that I do here, which is configure routing. And so I'm replacing the route, and I'm sending all requests to my controller. And the reason I do that is because I'm building a SPA app, single page app, which everything is driven by the client and not the server. So the only thing I want server to return is my shell page, quote unquote. So my cron. So I want a blank page that has some kind of a startup place for Angular 2. And that's really all I want from MVC. And technically speaking, you don't even need to do that. So you can have like index.html if you want. The reason I'm using CS.html in this case is because it gives me an easy way to inject server-side variables into client-side code. And I'll show how to do that.
Okay, that was exactly what I was going to ask. Well, you can tell it which your environment variable is set to. You can see what that is on the client.
You can. Yeah, so if you have environmental variables or whatever else, it's really, you can pass whatever you want as long as it sits inside CS.html file somewhere. So if I look at this example, so my startup control, my shell controller, which, like I said, all it does builds the shell. It doesn't have any MVC code besides the shell. And the controller is called home, and the action is called index. So what that means that every request that is not handled by static files middleware is going to result in me displaying the entire main page, no matter what I do. So that leads to, in my case, led to some hard to debug problems. I I mistyped the name of the CSS file somewhere, and then my app locked up because instead of CSS file, it was downloading the full page for me again. So it's the infinite loop, and the browser just hates infinite loops for whatever reason. And so you got to be a little bit careful with like things like that. You have to make sure that everything is handled, or you have to create some custom code in MVC that says, if a request comes in and you see .js somewhere in that route, just ignore it and return 404. Which means the static files wasn't found. I'm in MVC. Obviously, it's a request for JavaScript. I don't want to handle it, and I don't want to return the page. Do that. So you have to write some custom code. It's documented. If you like look for that, you'll find it.
So the static file doesn't handle the CSS and JS?
So all middleware handles requests. So for all it knows, you ask for something it doesn't know how to handle. So you say, I mistyped the JS file name. It gets the request. It says, oh, you're looking for whatever.js. I don't see it, which means I can't handle your request. I'm going to leave response as null. I'm going to see if somebody else wants to do something about it. Then MVC comes in, and if your path just happened to match MVC route, then what's going to happen is that MVC is going to start handling. And then he's probably going to error out with an error says, I can't find controller called whatever. Because that part of the URL happened to map to the standard controller name in the standard MVC route. It just, as you build in spas, it's just something to be aware of. So why do I do that? Why do I create this kind of problem for me? So the reason is deep linking. Because even though I'm building Angular app, I want to enable my users to email full URL to somebody, and they can click on it and then go to that screen. Not to my startup page, but to that screen. So what needs to happen then is that I need to return the shell page, but I don't want to strip the full URL out. I want to have the full URL that the user requested, return the shell page, then my Angular 2 will bootstrap, and then the client-side routing will take over and hopefully navigate to that component that handles that Angular 2 route. And in this case, I want MVC to simply ignore the routes and say, okay, what request comes in, if it doesn't have .js in it, serve the shell page. And then let Angular 2 navigate to the right place. So as you build in spas, that's the way you have to do it. So I think we're kind of done with the startup. So I'm going to pause here because we're mostly done. And we're going kind of fast, but I don't want you guys to be here till midnight. So Angular 2 is going to take a little longer. So, or maybe I do. So I want to pause here and just kind of recap where we are. We can create new project to do web API/MVC. You can write your normal controller, and what you will see that both MVC controller, which is home controller, and a person controller, which is technically web API controller, they inherit from the same class. Technically speaking, I didn't mention that, but technically speaking, you don't have to inherit, which is kind of interesting. It'll work without it. It'll work without base class. So the base class provides convenient methods like OK. So let's look at that code. And so now I'm building web API. So entity framework is done. Now I want to build a web API that returns all people from my database. So I'm doing this pretty explicitly. You can omit a lot of stuff based on conventions. So if you have a single method and you has word get in it somewhere, and it has no parameters, and it has no route, it'll automatically be invoked. I don't like that quite as much because somebody is going to add another get method and then your code is broken and you don't even know that it's broken because now there are two methods with word get in them that take no parameter and they both take HTTP verb get. So I like to be explicit, but you don't have to be. So we already looked at the controller level route. Then you can have method level route, which gets appended. So if I'm reading that, I'm going to say, what's my HTTP URL to get all? It's API / persons / whatever route is on the method. In this case, it's blank. So if I, okay, well, I have Postman here somewhere. So to invoke that, the URL would be, I love this splash screen. So the URL would be this. So if I want to do get all, that's what I need to call. Me. This. Localhost 500, which is what I'm hosting, /API /persons, nothing after that. And there is nothing after that because this is blank. So very, very explicit. And so how do I do get all? It's all async all the way through. This is really HTTP convention. So everything is IAction result, which is essentially HTTP response, in a sense. And so everything is that. However, if somebody goes maintain your code and they look and say, what does this return? I have no idea. Maybe it's returning the wrong thing. Who knows? So if you want to be more descriptive, this used to be like an add-on, like you use Swagger or something like that. It has an attribute. Now, ASP.NET Core has a built-in attribute. And it doesn't do anything other than describing for documentation purposes what it is that you're doing. So it has no relevance to execution. It has relevance to maintainability and documentation. So in this case, I'm saying that I'm producing response type of IEnumerable of person with the status code of 200 if everything works great. If things don't work, well, all bets are off. So now, how do I get the data? Everything's asynchronous. The only thing that's asynchronous here, so I'm building a query. So I'm saying from persons, order by name, select. There is no select, which means just return the person class. If I wanted to do select, maybe there's going to be a core talk here. You can learn more about other syntax. In this case, I'm just to return the person. What makes it async is to list async, meaning that create a query that says select stuff from persons order by name, essentially what it is. Read that in using the new data reader, DB data reader, whatever other stuff. There's no magic. For each row, create me an instance of a class person, compile the stuff to the list, and then return the control back to my thread. So that's what this statement does. And there are async methods to virtually all plain selects, all aggregate methods, everything in .EF core has async version. So you can say some async or distinct async, like they all have async versions. So if you buy into this async model, and personally I feel like you should, don't try to fight it, just go with the flow. So if you have an async method and doesn't have a weight in it, you'll actually get flagged for not doing things right. And then I'm calling the helper method, OK method. All it does, it produces HTTP response with the status code OK, which is 200, and a status reason phrase OK, which is just a convention, and a body, which is a JSON array of person object. There's obviously no word person in it, and all that. Okay, so let's run it just to see.
Just a quick question. Is that very similar to how Autonomous works in Node?
You're talking about async await?
Yeah.
Yes, except it's flatter.
Okay.
So you don't ever need to write then. It's a flatter code,
Right.
but it's the same code. It's the exact same. It's exact same thing. And actually, async await, if you use TypeScript, is available in Node in version 2. So you can actually write use words async and await, and it's coming to JavaScript, I think, this year. So you'll be able to write async await code in TypeScript.
Can you guess 7?
No, it'll compile to ES5. So it's TypeScript magic. So you write to new standards, but async await are coming to JavaScript as a standard, but it's like probably 2-3 years out. But the standard is fleshed out enough to where Microsoft felt like they could go ahead and just implement it based on what they see from the standards body. And they say, okay, we're going to write it because it looks very, very close. And our hope is that semantics are not going to be drastically changed when the standards body will approve async await in raw JavaScript. And because they're part of all those committees, they're representatives from Microsoft, they're part of every W3C committee. They're inside of it. It's not like they're trying to glean what committee is doing. They know exactly what they're doing. So, but in Node, if you write Node code, you can do it today. You just have to write it in TypeScript and not JavaScript and use version 2. And you can just do it right now. So, now I want to run it. So I'm in local environment and I want to run the thing. Whoops, I didn't want to do that. I want to do this. So how do I run this thing locally? So I can type .NET and there is a run command, which you don't have to import. It just comes with .NET thing. And that will run your project. So you need to be in a project folder, not in a solution folder. So if you look here, this is my solution folder, and this is my project folder. So there is one neat thing that I wanted to mention. There is watcher command. So .NET watch run will enable you not to ever compile in Visual Studio. So what's happening, oh, you can see migrations running, by the way, because I added console log into pipeline. Now I can see migrations run into my log. I see what it's doing. And then it says, now listening on port 5000. So while we're on .NET Watch Run, so I want to mention that. As what Watcher does, it monitors your source code. And as soon as you change the file, it'll kill Kestrel, which I didn't mention what Kestrel, and I should have. So Kestrel is the new server that was written specifically for .NET Core. Runs on Linux, runs on Windows. It's a web server. So when you host, you can host it as a standalone exe, or you can host it in IIS. But interestingly enough, when you host it in IIS, requests are handled by Kestrel. So they use the forwarding IIS module to just send a request to Kestrel. So they don't handle anything. And so Kestrel is much faster than IIS, built from ground up. It's faster than Node already. But I think twice as fast as Node, as far as handling raw requests. And they want it to be like in top 2, I think, is their goal of all web framework across all platforms and all languages. That's the goal. They feel they cannot get to Java. There's some Java framework that is just ridiculous. So they're not sure they're going to get there. But they want to be second after that. So I think they're up to like 1.3 million requests a second. And so another reason why you want to maybe adopt ASP.NET Core. If you have website with 1 million users, that's probably good. And if you make everything async, that's probably even better. And so there's some of those capabilities. So back to .NET Watch Run, all I have to do is change my controller, hit save. It takes it maybe like a second to kill the process, compile the project, restart the process. And if you have this command line open, you can actually see it happen. And eventually it'll come back to this. So back to my web API. Now that I'm running it, I can see what's happening here. So this is my method call said return OK and pass in a list of persons. So what I get here is my status code of 200, which is what OK produces. Status reason phrase is OK, which is also produces by convention. And then it has an array, because anything that is enumerable is an array. That's only representation in JavaScript. Obviously, I don't see class name or anything like that, but I see an instance of each class with the 2 properties that I declared on them, by convention, they're camel case. And so you can turn that thing off, and they turn the camel case on by default for, I think, release candidate, which messed a lot of people up because you update and nothing works. And that's because they just changed it. But in their defense, this is the standard. Like, this is what people want to see. So when you send stuff to JavaScript, camel case is the standard, not the proper case. So that's what that does. So if I want to look at the next method, get1, it's essentially the same code. I mentioned that all EF core methods have async counterparts. This is first or default. It's the exact same syntax, just add word async to the end of the method and await it. And other than that, it's all the same. So there is a little bit of standard code here. Again, if you don't want to write it, you don't have to write it. But all this does, if you pass me a wrong ID and I can't find it, the HTTP standard says you need to return 404 if you handle an HTTP request and the resource isn't there. So if you want to stick to standards as much as possible, handle invalid requests that way. Just return 404. And if you want to see that, and so I'll pull up a specific portion, like get on, I don't know if I have 3 in here, but we'll find out in a minute. So 3 returns a portion because that's real. But if I put 33, which is not real, you'll see that I got 404 with no body. So it's HTTP standard. Question?
Do you have any security concerns of these kind of queries? Is there any input validation that's considered best practice, or is any framework that's
Well,
considered safe by default?
in part, that's up to you, but Entity Framework, if you're using standard things, standard query mechanisms, it protects against dependency injection without you having to do anything.
Or like, okay, any kind of injection attack?
No, it's not subject to SQL injection. Because if you look under the cover, and if we really want to, since we're on the topic, so I can run a profiler, connect that, we're gonna run RPC completed and batch completed. I'm gonna turn everything else off, run, and I'm gonna switch to Postman. Here, I'm gonna fire it again, and I'm gonna flip back to my profiler, and here's my command. So as you can see, it uses, on SQL Server, it's using SP execute SQL, which is internally parameterized. And it passes in all the parameters as distinct values, meaning that it never concatenates any strings for it. So completely safe. Where you will get in trouble if you start building SQL strings yourself, which it does have API for that. It's more for flexibility purposes. And so I wouldn't recommend going that route unless you have just no other reason whatsoever. Question?
Any idea when they're going to get short props?
No. The short version. So I should probably mention that. So full rewrite is a bit of a stretch because some things are missing. So, but they're coming. It's not, the stop rock is not the only thing that's missing. Simple thing like junction tables right now are not supported either.
Is it the same entity SQL that you're using though?
It's not.
Or well, like when you're writing your queries, like.
It's just link.
Oh, well, right, okay.
There's no
There's
eSQL.
like link to entities and.
There's no eSQL and there is no EDMX. It's just code first.
Right. Okay.
So eSQL, ESQL, and EDMX were together. Database first approach. Those concepts are not implemented, period. So typically you would write link. Like link is the way to go. You can still drop down a level and do strings, which is, so I'll show you how to do it since we're on the topic. There's a execute something, context dot, there's a, can't find it now, database dot execute SQL command. So this one has an overload that takes a string. So still possible if you want to drop down to that level. And there is a query too here, so you can do execute.
What I guess what I
Maybe
was
just
really
query.
trying to get at was that you can use the same link in Entity Framework Core, given the same model that you could use in full Entity Framework.
That is exactly right.
Okay.
So I just saved the file, and if I look here, you see that it just killed the process and it's compiling again. So that's what you would see. So if you do .NET watch run, don't need to compile, just save. Just type save, flip to browser, refresh. Right? It's kind of very smooth developer flow.
Right. It makes it easy to use any editor.
Yep. Yep.
So you are using a attribute produces
ID.
no the next one produce response type.
Yep.
So what does it actually do? Like what would happen if you don't use it?
Nothing. It's just documentation attribute. It's not a runtime thing, so it doesn't do anything at runtime. But it gives you an ability to document your code in a standard way. Interestingly enough, you can do this. Like I didn't mention that. This is valid too. So you can write this kind of code. But you have to do something different here. Like you immediately stop compiling. But this is a valid code. So I could say, throw new not found exception, figure out some other way to do the same thing. But just like in Web API, this was valid code. You can still use that code. It's just slightly different syntax in your method to get it to compile. So you may have to create, maybe it's, there is an, so I used iAction result. So there's thing like an object result. So you can say object result of a person, for example. I think that's a thing. Oh, object result. Yeah, like that. Object result of person. I guess object result is not, doesn't have an attribute. But you can write your own thing if you have. But it does come into play like that. So you can write old code. You can use person in there. You can use whatever you want. The only thing that changes is this. So, but this is a little bit more restish, if that's a word.
About REST, I would like to check, but is it possible to implement SOAP APIs in?
I have no idea. I don't know.
Actually, I know we were considering some components that core, and one of the questions that is
There is
some of our other applications which integrate, they do
Right.
require us to implement SOAP services,
Right.
but that's the only thing they can call.
Yeah, I don't know the answer. There is an XML formatter though. So you can return the person, but format it as XML, but that's not exactly so. So I don't know the answer to that. Maybe you would have to write SOAP middleware in that case. And you would write the formatter yourself. So either a full middleware or just replace the formatter in the pipeline, which you can do. So default is the JSON serializer. I don't remember what it's called. It's a formatter or serializer. But the thing that reconciles the response with the request. So because my request, Postman. So if I look at my request headers, I don't have that. So that's a response. So because I had request header of content type application JSON, it automatically matched that up to the JSON serializer, and that's why I got it as JSON. So if you put XML in there, and there is a formatter that knows how to handle it, it'll automatically marry that up. And I think XML is supported already, but that's not SOAP. So you could write your own custom formatter, SOAP formatter or whatever. You would have to do it on your own. Like you would have to figure out how to do it, how to create the proper XML backend. So to some extent, it helps your goals, but to some extent, if you go back a little bit, then you're a little bit on your own if you want to support kind of older technologies, it's possible because it's completely open-ended. So you can plug in your middleware and do whatever you want because you get the response object. Like if you write middleware, what you get is request response, and then you can say, oh, I know how to get this response and serialize it as SOAP. And you can write SOAP middleware. Maybe someone's going to write it for you if it's a common use case. You can do it, in other words, but you're on your own. So one thing I didn't mention is how to map parameters. So in this case, I'm mapping the URL. It's not really a query string, but query string is supported too. It's just a URL chunk. And in this case, it's the ID, which is just a substitute from the URL. So the way you read it is, I'm going to start at API/persons/a thing, and I'm going to name the thing ID. And by convention, it's going to find a parameter called ID, parse this thing, this 33, with an int parser, and pass it into your method as the parameter. It'll do the same thing when you do a put or post. In those cases, I'm passing in the full person. I'm being kind of explicit here from body attribute on the parameter. I really don't have to do it because for put and post, by convention, it's going to look in the body. I just did it just for illustration purposes, which means it has a ton of conventions in. So again, it's going to find, if I make post call with some JSON body, it's going to marry it up to a person class the best it can. So essentially going to deserialize a person. If you mistype the property name, it's going to be null because it's just not going to match it. It is case insensitive though, so whatever you set up, it's going to find the proper property. And it will do object graphs too. So if you have property inside, which is another object graph, and it'll just drill down, it'll build it all out for you. So it does all that. This is very similar code that you wrote in Web API before. Model state is still there, which is, it's going to look at things like data annotations and say, oh, you flagged name as required, I'm passing you a blank name, a null name. Well, that's not allowed. So it's going to throw it back out. And model state automatically is going to be set. And then I'm going to say, if model state is not valid, what I'm going to do is return 500 with a body of the error. In this case, body of the error is the JSON serialized model state object contained in the error. Otherwise, again, the only async here is save changes async. So this is really not async code. I'm just saying the state of the person is passed into me. I'm going to tell entity framework it's a brand new thing. I'm going to set the state to edit. Alternatively, I could say _context.persons.add. Same code. I just find that this is easier and you can do it in multiple methods. So update, you will find that it's almost identical code, except they finally wrote like a little helper method called update. So if you, in Web API, you write an update method and you pass in a person, you can write code like this. Entity state.modify, just like this. However, if person has a list of phones in it, then to get the phones to update, you're on your own. So you gotta find a phone inside the person and set its state to modify, or it just simply won't update. So they fixed that in .NET Core, and this update method handles object graphs. So it doesn't care how deep it goes, it's going to flag everything as modified and flush everything out for it. That's super convenient because you literally write dozens of lines of codes before to handle this simple use case. Props. Gotta give credit when credit is due. That's how we live. So delete, you can do it the old way. So you can fetch it, flag the state as deleted, and save async. Where that's annoying is that your delete results in a query first. So here I'm kind of demonstrating how to do that without a fetch. So I'm creating person object from thin air, I'm not setting a name on it because I don't really care. I'm only setting the ID on, and I'm setting its state to delete it. So entity framework starts tracking it at that point, but because it wasn't tracking it before, it's not going to kick out with validation error because I never changed the name. So it's going to flush it out for me, even though I never set the name.
Will it also delete the child records associated?
No, but there is no match and delete thing like this. There is no match and delete. So if you have child rows, your options are you have to write that, or you can use things like referential integrity and set up your rules to delete. So you can do that. So you have some options. But delete doesn't work like update. Update is to flag everything in the object graph as modified. Delete is a little bit scary because what if you want to delete one phone? How do you express that? Right? Maybe you don't want to delete it because maybe it's not a direct child, maybe it's some referenced entity. So making decisions how to cascade deletes like in the middle of object graph is a little hard because you have to make assumptions. And so that's probably why they didn't do it for deletes. That's my guess, because you can't do it and not have somebody tell you did it wrong, way wrong. So they just didn't do it. So if you look, and this is a custom method, has nothing to do with anything. It's just demonstrations how I write an arbitrary code to do arbitrary things. Because before that was all CRUD. This thing just checks to see if the name is duplicates. Because in my Angular UI, if you type in the same name twice, I wanted the software to tell you, hey, I already have a person with that name, so you can't do that. So that's that implementation. So it's just to show you how to write completely arbitrary code in Web API and Entity Framework. So in this case, I'm using URL. So dupe is like a prefix. Going back here, it's going to be API/persons/dupe/person's name/person's ID. Automatically going to be parsed out, and I'm going to get name and ID here. And my select word is simple. I'm checking any method also has async version, which returns a Boolean. So I'm doing, do I have any person with that name but with a different ID? And if so, it's a dupe. And in this case, I'm returning a Boolean straight up. So it's not even a JSON result. It's just a straight up true or false, which is valid. All right, so this is, I think we need to move to Angular because we're rapidly running out of time. So any questions on Web API? Moving on. I'm going to flip to slides so I don't miss anything. Slides. And then I'm going to kind of skip through. Okay, here we go. Quick Angular thing. Does anybody not know what Angular is? So I can skip some slides. I'm skipping slides. Skipping some slides. Okay, I'm going to pause on this one. So why Angular 2 was rewritten. It's really hard to say for sure, but it's a better framework. So there are features in it that you don't have in Angular 1. So 1 is more follows web components preliminary specs, where you can have an HTML island in DOM with functionality and events and properties and attributes. I mean, events and attributes and whatever else. They kind of follow that standard. So the high level Angular 2 component is like a web component. Island of UI plus logic. That's what that is. So API is much more in line with where web is going. It's also, at least by their own measurements, at least twice as fast as Angular 1. With a smaller API footprint, so it's less stuff for you to learn, and smaller memory footprint. And I already mentioned better performance, but it's also smaller library, just less code. So what's new? Because everybody knows Angular 1. So there is slightly different data binding syntax. They promote unidirectional data flow. which is if you work with React, you probably heard it. So Angular 1 was two-way data binding. So once you opt in, you can, in some child component, rebind parent component somehow and replace everything, because everything would flow all the way up. So what they encourage you to do is to have flow all the way down. In other words, you have parent component, which is a list of persons that I want to show. Then inside there I have child component, which is individual person. And inside there I may have a phone numbers component, which shows the phone numbers. What they encourage you to do, you only assign person way up on top, and then you start passing the data down, but not by direction, unidirectional, meaning child component can't reach out all the way to parent and start replacing the phone numbers. What it can do, not to be confused with the fact that you can buy the input of type text to a person name, and that is two-way data bind. But that does not mess with the data flow in your app. It simply binds one text box to one property, but you'll not start pushing objects up the object tree. So if you do one way, not only it's easier for you to reason, but Angular 2 is faster, because it doesn't have to track the change state from the bottom component all the way, to the top. It just doesn't need to do it. TypeScript is a huge thing to me. So it's not all about competition, it's also about collaboration. That's how web world works. There's a lot of it in there. This is prime reason. So when Angular 2 started, which was I guess 3 years ago at this point, they actually wrote their own language. If anybody ever heard of script, they wrote the language to write Angular 2 in. Or they started down that road. But then they saw TypeScript and they said, okay, it all works for us, but it's missing this one feature, this data annotation. So remember data annotations we used? So there is a similar data annotations now in TypeScript that wasn't there before Angular 2 started. What that drives is dependency injection. So data annotations are important because that's how dependency injection works. Yes, tooling has the same not the right word, but it has a CLI or command line interface that does a whole bunch of useful things like create you a new component, kind of scaffold it out, give you like a little baseline with a component, an HTML template, and some code, and a test, and a module. So it does some useful things. It can also integrate with Angular 1 if you choose to do so, meaning you can migrate your Angular 1 app to Angular 2 app slowly, rather than say, okay, we're going to be full rewrite. So we hope we're not going to ship a bazillion bugs when it's done. So you don't have to do that. It started with not supporting IE9, but somebody contributed a ton of time, one company, which thought that IE9 was like the best thing since the slice of bread. And they contributed a ton of effort. It's a community effort to support IE9. Initially it wasn't happening. Then again, nobody cares about IE9, so I don't know why they did that, because nobody does. Who knows? Seemed like a good idea at the time. So, I think I'm gonna depart from slides, and hopefully I'm not gonna forget anything. So let's depart from slides, and we're gonna walk through a critical part of Angular. In this specific demo, I'm putting all the code into app folder. So if you download the thing, you can kind of find things. So let's start by my simple component. So for example, if I run this thing, and I'm going to go to the root, I have this simple thing called, I don't want to start with that, but I have a home page. So home page is a component with one button. As simple as it gets. So let's look at what component in Angular 2 is. This is the simplest component. So router is optional, don't need that. So squint. And so the only thing I need to import, and this is the TypeScript thing. So because everything is modular, You need to import the module you're interested in before you can use any classes from that module. In this case, I'm importing Angular core because by reading documentation, which is on angular.io, I know that's where my component declaration is. More specifically, it's a component decorator class, not the component class, component decorator class. And what it does, it tells Angular that this plain vanilla TypeScript class I wrote from Angular perspective is an injectable component with some kind of UI and some kind of logic and some kind of dependency injection thing that it might ask me to pass in, and I will gladly do so if you tell me. It's kind of complicated. So let's read. Question?
Well, two questions. One, does Angular give you your typing styles when you?
Yes, it does. So it just works.
And is this component keyword related to the HTML5 component, web component?
Not direct, only in spirit. That's how I would phrase it.
Awesome. Okay.
But not directly in any kind of way.
Okay.
Where did you look up Angular to start with?
Where?
Yeah. I mean, you have to import any files or?
It's all NPM.
Okay.
So NPM. So there is like a quick starter thing, or you can use Node Package Manager to do the thing. So I could.
.json or anything.
Yeah, it's the thing, because I don't know why, because it just is. So you can do it from here. So ASP.NET Core inside Visual Studio, there's a new UI that allows you to control NPM directly in it, so you don't have to drop down. But I find that it's easier to just drop down. So you can drop down to command line, just open the file, or in Studio you can right-click on npm, and somewhere in here you can click open package.json, and then you see all the Angular goodness. So all the way up to here, these are all Angular module and they're scoped. So if you haven't seen npm at thingy, that's what they call a scope. So which means there is some higher level packaging. It's called at Angular. So it's inside Angular scope in NPM, there is a module called common. Or more specifically, NPM package called common, which contains some common Angular 2 modules, for lack of a better word. The other stuff that is Angular is this. These two things. So reflect metadata is needed to implement this add component decorator, because what that does, it produces this metadata, so you can compile to even ES5, and in JavaScript it's going to look at it, parse it out, and say, okay, you want to build home page component. What does your HTML look like? I know because you decorated this class with a component decorator, and it has a property called template, and inside that property called template, I have the actual HTML that I'm going to shove into DOM and bind to some business properties or method or whatever else I have in that component. And you get used to it pretty quickly. So at a minimum, valid component decoration needs two things. It's your template, because you need to know how to represent that in the UI, and you need a selector which tells it which DOM tag I want to replace with this HTML, which means somewhere I have something called home-page. So if I search for that, I will find it in my home.ts, and here. Okay, well, it's in the same class. So this is the selector. So if I want to use home page somewhere in HTML, this class. I need to type a tag, home-page. It'll automatically figure out what that means and replace that tag with the content of this. And now it's going to do some data bind. So we're going to talk right quick about data bind, which is by far, not by far, in my opinion, one of the most powerful features of client-side HTML, JavaScript / based framework, because it allows you to write ton less code. Speaking from experience, I was the one writing code like $name.val with or without parameter, line after line after line after line. That code just disappears. I hear some sympathetic laughs. So data binding. There are 4 different kinds of data binding. So you have a property binding, which we'll look at in a minute. There is event binding, and there is two-way data binding. And there is an attribute binding, I want to say. So if it's an event or a method binding, essentially, because the event is kind of a method, that is wrapped in standard parentheses. So the way I read this is I have a button tag decorated with a click data binding. Then in Angular 1, if anybody remembers, you used to have to write ng-click equal blah, if you remember that. So ng-click or ng-mouse over, gone. So as long as you know what that's called in a DOM, you write the DOM event in parentheses. Angular will automatically respond to DOM events and marry them up to your methods. So what I wrote here is, I have a button, listen to click events, in response call the method on this component, because there is nothing prefixed, there is no dotted syntax, I don't have things like, blah dot invalid, which would work. So I don't have anything prefixed, it's on me. So if I want this to work, I better have a method called invalid. And I do indeed right here. And then I'm going to do something. While we're talking about DOM events, this thing still works. I can only type the $sign. So this thing, just like it used to work in Angular 1, still works in Angular 2. $event means passing the original event as you call my method, if I need it. What is interesting here is exact same syntax works for your custom events. Exact same thing. There is no difference between what I write for native DOM or for this. So in order for any component to work, it has to be modularized. And module is kind of a new concept in Angular 2 that didn't exist in beta of Angular 2 and showed up after release candidate 3, I think, in Angular 2. And what that is, you think about ng module. If you want to think about it conceptually and you know C#, it's like assembly. In other words, you write classes, just like you write classes, and you put them in an assembly. In Angular 2, you put them into a module. So it's a unit of packaging your application. And you cannot invoke components directly. They have to live in a module. So let's look at a module. So this is the root module. So you need to have at least root module, which will bootstrap your app. But you can have other modules. So in this demo, I also have context module. And if I want this packages or assemblies, ng modules work together, just like I have to use using statement in C#, I have to import them or reference them from one another. In this case, because my root module also going to display people, and people are in context module, I'm importing context module into this root module. The other interesting part that it has is bootstrap. So bootstrap means what's my starting component. So this says I have a component called app, and I can actually navigate to it right here, and F12 works. So I have a component called app. So what I'm telling that module, root module, I'm saying when you stand up and you recognize that everything you need, my starting component is my component called app right here, which has no code in it because I don't need to bind, I don't need to put any logic in it. It's just the starting point of my app. And then as the app comes up, it'll bootstrap and my app component comes up. And app component is linked to app-shell selector. Where do I find that app.shell? I'm going to go to views. I'm going to look for the only shell page that I have, CS_HTML page. This is where I find the app shell. So what's going to happen when my app bootstraps Angular 2, it's going to say my root component is app. It's married to HTML tag called app shell. I'm going to find app-shell in the DOM, replace it, more precisely put stuff under, and I'm going to take this DOM, whoops, I'm going to take this DOM from my app component right here. I'm going to shove it into that marker, app-shell. And I'm going to have some DOM. And then it's going to come up. So this kind of describes basic component with really nothing in it. So add component decorator with two attributes, which is a template and the selector, which is a tag. And you're ready to go. So something will work. And then you have to put it in ng module, and then you have to bootstrap ng module. So bootstrapping is done in this class. So you have to write this somewhere. And this is this thing that needs to be invoked when your JavaScript is loaded initially. So main is really sort of like your program.cs or a startup.cs where we're just looking at. And main is the convention. Like you could have called it, startup for all, they don't care. But you need to have one line of code, which is this one. And what this one does is bootstraps your root module, which in turn specifies your root component. At that point, your app is up and running. So somewhere, you need to tell something that your starting point is main.js file. So in this specific demo, using system.js, and somewhere in here, I say that right here. So for my app module, my starting point is main.js. So when system.js comes up, which is the module loader this demo is using, it'll find my main.js, load it up. That will in turn create my root module, which will in turn will create my root component, and that the whole thing will eventually come up and show up in this app shell placeholder that I. So this is kind of complicated. So if you compare it to Angular 1, I feel like code-wise, this is a lot more complicated. Luckily, you only write that code once, and from that point on, you're just creating components. You just don't touch it. Angular CLI, out of the box, comes up with Webpack. So system.js is kind of convenient for the demos, but what they recommend that you use Webpack, and that's where they invest in the time. System.js will still work, but Webpack is a recommended route. But it also has like similar concept, like what's my starting JavaScript file that I want to run. All really module loaders, they all have similar concept, like concept of modules with some relative URL, some kind of an entry point, and some kind of a starting concept. They all have that. Webpack has some advanced concepts, like, I'm not sure if you've heard of tree shaking. So if you look at how big is Angular 2 is, folder, it's like megs. It's big. And say you're never using some feature. Then if you use Webpack, it'll physically remove JavaScript you're not using as it's packaging up your app. So it makes your app small. And it also makes it faster because whatever you package, browser has to parse no matter what. So if you package less, it's a win in two ways. So I don't want to spend too much time on that because I feel like spending more time on components, which is what you write most of the time, is kind of more important. So CLI does all that. So now let's look at other data binding. So I had, we looked at straight up event binding. So let's look at property binding. Here is the input, and it's bound to, okay, well, this goes deep into form, so let's skip that for now. The other thing that there is still in there is a straight up interpolation binding, which is double mustaches. Everybody knows what I'm talking about? I'm gonna pull up that slide because I think we're running kind of low on time, and I want to pull up this slide on data binding, at least show you the syntax. So straight up string interpolation, just like Angular 1, which is find squiggly brackets with whatever property is in them, look in a component for the same property, and replace this placeholder with the actual value. String interpolation also works with functions. In general, data binding works what's called the binding expression, or just expression. So if you read Angular documentation, you would see this word over and over, Angular expression. Essentially, it's a binding expression, and which is function, just the property, dot its syntax is supported, you can do blah dot blah blah dot name. That all works, just like it does in Angular 1. So string interpolation is one syntax.
All the formatting stuff too?
Format?
Like the pipe and then like date colon, short date, whatever.
Sort of. We'll cover that in like a minute.
Oh.
And so property binding is square brackets. So you saw one in there, but it wasn't quite the same thing. But in general, property binding is square brackets. Event we already saw, which is parentheses. And two-way data binding, because it's a combination of property binding plus event binding, meaning that when a user interacts with a DOM, it's the event binding, because your model is updated. And when you interact with a model, then the DOM is updated. That's a property binding. So that's why they picked square brackets with parentheses inside for two-way data binding. That indicates that data flows from DOM to your model, which is, I didn't mention it, it's just a plain JavaScript object. It's just Pojo. Nothing special about it. And data flows from DOM to my model and from model to my DOM, two-way. So that's when you use this syntax. This syntax has an overhead. So if your data is one directional, so don't use that because it has an inherent overhead associated with the data binding. So we looked at the plain vanilla component. If you ever saw, or if you ever written Angular 1 code, you probably wrote some kind of a service using either .service method or .factory method. So that is some kind of a cross-cutting concern that addresses some specific issue in your code that is not UI related typically. Although some people would write UI-based services too that do something UI related, but it's not quite as typical. In here, there's a concept of a service, but it's more broad, and it's an injectable decorator right here. So what that means is, if in my constructor of my component I ever ask for contact service class, that means look at the dependency injection, and if it was decorated with injectable attribute, it'll find it, it'll create new instance of that class, not really class, it's called class, and shove it into my constructor. So if I looked at, say, contact list component, you will see that in my constructor, I'm injecting contact service type. There is nothing I need to do. So if you remember the magic in Web API where I injected my context, same concept. Like I don't write any code. I just decorate my injectable or my service with an injectable decorator, and then I can ask for it in any constructor of any component, and it's going to be created and passed into me. So that seems kind of simple on the surface, but say your service, contact service, has its own constructor, and in this case it wants configuration, which is my own class. It's the injection all the way down, or all the way up, depending on how you look at it. But the entire structure necessary is going to be built out automatically. The only thing I have to do is remember at injectable attribute. Technically speaking, in some use cases, it'll actually work without it, but it's better to always use. First of all, it's easy for you to understand that you want to inject that versus just some helper class you wrote. So it's more readable code. And second of all, there are some use cases where without that attribute, it just won't work. So now, thinking about components, I'm going to stay on component called contact list. Components is at the heart of Angular 2. When you build Angular 2 app, it's this giant tree of components. That's what it is. It's like turtles all the way down, except it's not turtles, it's components. So, all works the same way, interestingly enough. So let's look at this. For example, I have a component called contact list that gives me a list of people, those person with a name and ID we saw. Inside there, I reference another component, contact item. This just works by magic. So if I look at contact list item class, its selector is contact item. So when this component is being instantiated, Angular is going to say, oh, I have this tag. I'm going to look to see what else you got in here. And I'm going to try to find a component that matches the tag based on selector in a component attribute. And once I find it, I'm going to shove it in there. And then this component can have another component called blah blah. All match. Just like dependency injection works all the way down, components work all the way down. There's nothing you need to do. You're just going to build your thing. So this is an example. Like I didn't have to do that, but I wanted to demonstrate how do you make nested components, one inside the other. In this case, what I'm using is contact list. I'm also using ng4. So if you ever did Angular 1, you remember ng-repeat. So there's a new thing of that, and it's a star ng4. Same thing, same kind of concept, slightly different syntax, but essentially it's an enumerator. So what I'm enumerating now is contact-item tag, which is a fake tag. And for each instance of a person, this thing is going to create for me an instance of that other component. And then here we see unidirectional data flow via property binding. So my contact item component actually has a property called content. And what am I passing in? I'm passing in my enumeration variable called item. One-way data binding from component to component to component to component. So nothing flows up. It's easier for Angular to monitor changes. It's easier for you to reason about your app. So there are some other directives in there. So let's look at a couple of things. One of them Kevin mentioned, which is pipes. So in addition to components, there is a thing called pipes. Interestingly enough, again, TypeScript class, decorator called pipe, add pipe. Name in here is your attribute. That makes sense? So let me pull up contact list item. And we're looking for pipe called shorten. Right here. So it's a string interpolation binding. But instead of putting up contact name, I want to run that name through the pipe. As pipe, as name implies, you put some in and you'll get some out. So that's what pipe is. So it implements an interface called pipe transform, one method in out. Value in, value out, plus supports parameters. So if we look at the syntax, you see I have one parameter called column and then some value. And then you can do another column, next parameter, and just chain them out. They're going to be automatically parsed out and passed in as arguments, as an array of things that you specify. And then you can do whatever you want. In this case, this pipe, all it does, it says if the contact name is longer than 4 characters, I'm going to strip it down to 4 characters and put ellipses at the end of that. It's a trivial example, but it demonstrates the purpose. Pipe is thin in, thin out. Look at parameters if you want to, and give it some back. There are also, this is what's called a pure pipe. There is something called async pipe. And transform method in async pipe, instead of returning any, it returns promise of any. So all you need to do is return a promise out of it, and when the promise is resolved, the framework will automatically take that value, resolved value, and shove it into DOM for it. So it kind of monitors for promise resolution. So that's a pipe, another concept. There is a concept of directive. So I didn't mention that component is an example of a directive. Let me flip back to slide for a second, because I think I have a slide on that I think may be decent, or maybe not. Oh, there is one. Question?
Yeah. How are components tied to a view model?
Component tied to what?
View model. Actual model.
View model is the component itself.
Okay. So if you reuse the component in some other place, how does it get the right data?
It's the code you write in your component. So think of your component as view model, or more purely, it's a pojo. It's a JavaScript object, and it has stuff hanging on it. So it has members like functions and literals, whatever. Let's call them properties and methods. So no matter where you create your component, it's just a class. And in your constructor, you can do stuff. And you can populate your properties, and you can set your methods to do things. Doesn't matter where you instantiate that specific component. It's the same functionality. And it's the same template. Because when I use that add component decorator, I say, here's my template. And here is my tag name. And then inside of it, I write whatever code I want. Essentially, you write in business logic that does things and binds to the view, binds to that template. So when you reuse component, you don't get different thing. You get the exact same thing. Make sense? So there are three types of directives. Components we already saw, and there are structural directive, and the only one I know is ng4. So it's kind of an artificial way to segregate directives. Structural means that it alters DOM in some major way. ng4 will replace one tag with a bunch of things. In my case, I'm replacing a li tag with a name for each person, right? And there is an attribute directive, which I don't think I have an example there, but those do some small, typically DOM manipulation. Actually, I have one. Take it back. So I have one that's called make large. So this is the attribute directive. So again, I have a selector, except this selector is an attribute selector. It's not a tag element selector. It's not a tag selector. It's an attribute selector on a tag. And in this case, called make large. So if I look contact list item, I will find, hopefully, right here, make large. So there is nothing in there. It just looks like a normal attribute. But what it really is a directive, which is the plain attribute directive. And I just do stuff in it. So typically, those directives, they're there to alter DOM in some minor way. This one turns the font, changes the font color. So if I look at this, go here, this is what my make large directive does. It makes font larger and changes the color to red. So this is like, so it doesn't work, in other words, it doesn't do any major stuff, it kind of enhances DOM in some way. So the reason I want to show that, because it's using DOM abstractions. So you could write against raw HTML DOM if you want to, but they do provide a couple of abstractions. So there is an element ref, and this is just a HTML element abstraction. And there is some called renderer, which is an abstraction on top of doing things to that DOM element. So one operates on another. So an example is, if I want to make font size 200% of predefined one, I would tell the renderer to set the style, and then I'm gonna use the element ref to get an instance of native element, and I'm setting the style attribute font size to 200%. So you have a very thin level of abstraction on top of DOM. So the advantage of that is, so you would think, like, why can't I just set on DOM? The way you have to think about it is testing on a server. So say you want to test this code outside of browser. So if you say, hey, give me DOM model isn't there, because you're not running the browser, there is no DOM. So this kind of thin abstraction has an important purpose, which is testability. But it also lets you write a little bit more uniform code for simple. So we hit directives, we hit components, we hit pipes, we hit services, we didn't hit routing. So we're going to try to hit that pretty quickly. So when it comes to routing, you can do attribute. So there is a routing directive, interestingly enough, and I will find it here in a second. It's here. So there is a router link directive, which again is an attribute directive, but it's part of routing, client-side routing of Angular 2. So what that automatically does, when you click on a thing that is decorated with this attribute, the router will automatically kick in and navigate to the specified URL. In this case, when I click on home button, it'll navigate to the home URL. So how do I do URLs? Here's how we configure routes. Routes, in the simplest way, it has other properties, but in the simplest way, you think about it, URL and the component that I'm going to instantiate when I move to that URL because that component is responsible for handling that page. Again, URL is the forefront. After all, we're building a web app, but first and foremost, it's web. And web is all about URLs. So in here, what I'm configuring in routes, I'm saying when my URL is home page is responsible for that rendering once I'm navigated to that route. And Angular runtime is automatically does that. So if I even type home or I click on the button that goes to home, it's going to say, hey, I'm going to home route, who's responsible? And it's going to look in all of your route configuration and find the responsible component and automatically shove it in there. So in that case, it's not a tag that matters, but the route that matters. And that's why I couldn't find for home page, remember I couldn't find the tag anywhere? Because it doesn't matter. It's a route handling component. And where does it go? Because I gotta shove it somewhere, right? So anybody remembers ngView? Instead of ngView, I have a thing called router outlet, which is, I don't know, a directive or a component, same thing. And a router outlet is the placeholder, which is a replacement for ngView. So as I navigate in this component, as I navigate to home, by clicking on, or to contacts, by clicking on this contacts link, what the router is going to do is going to say, okay, you told me you're interested in a route called contacts. I'm going to look in my route registration, find out which component is responsible for that. I'm going to initialize it. Then I'm going to look at whatever DOM it's supposed to create, at the template. And then I'm going to shove this template right under this router outlet. So it doesn't really replace router outlet, it puts stuff under. But because router outlet is not something known to browsers, it's rendered as a div. And because the div has no content, you can't really see. It's there, but you can't see. But the placeholder doesn't go away. So it stays there, but you can't tell it's there. And so that's how the navigation works and how the components are instantiated. Last thing I want to cover is forms. So there are two types of forms. And this form is what's called a reactive form. So if you remember Angular 1 forms, they're all attribute based. So you would say input, so you would do ng-form, if you remember. And then inside there you do an input and you would bind it to some property on your controller and the form would work. So you can do something similar in Angular 2 as well. So that's one type of form. It's sort of like, I don't know what it's called. It's like an attribute-based form configuration. What I show here is something that you would use, which is reactive forms. Something you would use for more complex use cases. Which means if you're not building the form with one field, where you can use attributes. You start running into more complex scenarios, more complex validation, you need more control. So because like normal forms are very similar to Angular 1, I decided to write in this demo Angular 2 way, which is reactive forms. So reactive forms is this form group class. That's kind of a reactive form. And the way I create it, it's a dictionary. So in this case, I only have a name. So as I create a form, a group, form group instance, I'd say, build me a group. I have one property in this one. Well, two in this one, actually. I have a name and I have a person ID. So I'm going to say name, key. Value is an object. Let's put it this way. There is actually a declaration here. So you can say it's actually specified as any. But what I'm passing in, there is actually a convention there and a signature for reactive forms. First is a value, then synchronous validators, and then async validators, which we didn't cover, but I feel like people are falling asleep. So I'm gonna wrap it up here in a minute. So my initial value is null, because I don't have one. I could have put an initial value in if I wanted. Then I can combine validators. So if you remember what I configured in Entity Framework, I said name required, no more than 30 characters long. I'll mimic that here. So I say I have required validator, which is built into Angular, and max length validator, which is built into Angular. And I do what's called compose. And what I'm doing is building pipeline of validators. So as I start typing the name, it's going to start calling those validators in sequence, one after another, in the order in which you specify. And then you have a async validator. Async validator returns a promise instead of a true-false kind of a thing, or more precisely, null or a value. So null means I'm good. Any kind of value means that's my error message. So that's how validators work. So in this case, I have an async validator, name exists, and I don't want to pull it up because it's totally confusing code, but it calls the dupe method, if you remember, in Web API. And it simply returns null. So if I return true, meaning it's not a dupe, it returns null, means it's valid, or it returns a value, which means that's the error. So show that error, whatever the heck that is. Now, how do I do that? How do I do the errors? So in previously, you saw that I used template to specify the HTML for the component. In this case, I use template URL, meaning that the template is external. So that way, I separate my HTML from my logic. And some people like it, and some people don't like it. That's why they give you an option. Typically, when the component changes, typically your template would change and your logic would change. That would change at the same time. So it's kind of convenient to have it in one file. Where it becomes a problem if that file is 2,000 lines long. And that is just not good. So one reason for you to separate, your templates get kind of large. Another reason to separate is your editor. Some people just like HTML in IntelliSense. It's because it's kind of nice. Because it's a string, most editors don't understand it. Although that's starting to change. For example, ReSharper supports that now. It supports HTML editing inside JS files. And all you have to do is put like an attribute on that property that says this is language equal JavaScript, and it just does the magic. And other editors start to go that way around too, where they recognize that you have HTML inside JavaScript and they give you HTML IntelliSense there. It's not quite as popular, but I think give it like 2 years where everybody's going that way and every editor is going to support that. And you'll have fewer reasons to separate it. But size is still an important reason. Because if you change in the logic and the first 200 lines of code is HTML before you see the logic, that's kind of annoying. Not good. So that's a template URL. So if we look at it, you see this is reactive form binding. So there is an attribute called form group that comes with the reactive form data binding. I'm binding it to my variable, which is the form configuration inside my component. And that's all I need to do. Just think of it as ng form. This is the ng form replacement. Except you say, to configure my ng form, use this property in my object. It'll tell you what it looks like. So that's how reactive forms work. Non-reactive forms, just different attributes, mostly the same syntax. But all attribute names are different. And then for each input, there is another directive called form control name what that means is this thing right here. So form control name maps form group dictionary to that input control. What that does, it tells you, okay, which validators do I need to run when users start typing in the name? It's going to say, oh, I'm bound to the name property of form configuration. Oh, I have 3 validators in it. As I start typing, I'm going to start calling. So that's how that works. And then there is all familiar ng if, but it's a camel case now syntax. Other than that, it's exactly the same. Again, Angular expression. This API is a reactive form API. So what is person form is this thing right here. So it's the property that sits on my component called person form. So my ng if is bound to person form. Its API has controls, which is the dictionary, which is what we create, that dictionary. And then it's going to say, hey, if this name, which is another object, has a method called hasAir, and I have 3 different validators on it, right? I have a required, max length, and dupe. Each one of these divs is going to show an appropriate air. So I think I'm gonna wrap it up as soon as we see how that works. So if I delete it, so my required validator just kicked in. If I type too much, here's my max length validator kicked in. And here's my sync validator in action. And how did it come up? So if I hit F12 and look at the network, and I'm going to type in that. Unfortunately, it's a little hard to see, but you can take my word for it that somewhere down in here there is a HTTP request, right down in there, not in this resolution. But there is an HTTP request was made. And binding to input boxes work just like in Angular 1. Every keystroke is triggering the rebinding and the revalidation. So I delete one letter and the duplicate just came in. And it was async stuff. Any questions on that? I know there are a ton of questions on that, but any questions I can quickly answer on that.
Yeah, I got one real quick question. So, I've used the CLI tool, right? The Angular CLI tool, create a new project, and I use Visual Studio Code to pretty much code against it. Using Visual Studio 2015, what's the scaffolding of the project like when you import those libraries through NPM?
There is none.
None. You have to wire all that up yourself.
There are some project templates, I think, on the community that will give you like a head start. Or what you're saying, those things are not kind of mutually exclusive. In other words, you can create ASP.NET project and then use CLI to fill in the gaps. And CLI does things like create new component. It'll spit out your template and your component properly decorated, and it's going to automatically add it to imports. Not imports, but exports of the module, or declaration, I mean. And then it'll write the test class for it, like a stub. I didn't do any of it here. I just kind of wrote it from scratch because I think I'll learn better that way. But there is no direct integration in there. But there are enough extensibility points to where you can work something out by just combining the two or just writing it yourself. So built-in pipes, it's pretty much the same pipes that you saw in Angular 1. So like $sign and blah. But what is interesting here, there is an async pipe too. An async pipe returns a promise. So you can asynchronously format your data. But pipes, again, pipes are like, how do I want to format the data flowing from my model to my UI? So that's what pipes are. Talked about navigation. I didn't look at navigating code, but there is a router service, an injectable and you say router.navigate. And you inject it in your component just like you inject everything else. And what do you pass in? It's the same thing you pass into router link attribute. It's like your URL plus your parameters. Okay, so official name is template-driven forms. So non-reactive forms, which is essentially very similar to Angular 1. So it's all about attributes binding directly to some raw person class inside your component. Whereas this has like form configuration, and then when you use reactive forms, you patch in your value. So code is you create form configuration, which is form group, and then once you get a person to add it, you say form group.patch value, and you pass in the thing, and that does all the data binding. Okay, I'm gonna wrap it up because it's been like 2 hours and everybody's asleep, including me. So, what I didn't cover, CLI, which this gentleman mentioned, CLI command line interface, which is, it can do production builds for you, including the tree shaking I mentioned. You can do some basic scaffolding, which is like new app. So you can create new app. You remember how it would write, remember that root module I wrote? It would write that root module. It would write your root component. It would write your, I don't think it writes route. And it would write bootstrapper. So it'll give you a head start. It'll give you something that is runnable. And it can scaffold a new component. So you can create new component, and it'll create template, component, test, and whatever that fourth thing is, I forget. So that's a CLI. And the testing example, the Angular 2 itself is tested in Jasmine. But you can use other frameworks, but out of the box is Jasmine. And I think CLI actually has a test command that would use Karma, JavaScript test runner, to run your test. And in the past, I'm gonna say I tried it once, doing it myself, just awful. Like, try to configure JavaScript test run is just a ridiculous experience. They just do it all for you. There's no other way of putting it. It's ridiculous. So I didn't cover that. Server-side compilation, I should mention that, or ahead-of-time compilation. So compilation is an overloaded term in this case. So remember how we have a component with a template. When I say instantiate it, guess what happens? It compiles. So what does that mean? It says, when I look at my HTML template, it's going to say, oh, I see make large directive here. I know what that means. I'm going to rip that out and wire up your directive so it works. And then it's going to say, oh, I see a pipe. I know what that means. I'm going to rip that out and replace it with some JavaScript that knows how to do that. And then it says, oh, I see contact item component. I know what that is. I'm going to rip that out and replace it with the actual contact item DOM. So it does all that at runtime. So what happens, it's a little faster now, but if you try like beta 30 or something like that, it's like a minute before your app comes up. Like literally a whole minute. So it's faster now, but it's not fast. So this ahead of time compilation or server-side compilation, it's compiled in Angular. In other words, it's looking at your component and it's preparing them for display in a more efficient way. So essentially, your JavaScript is being transformed into this pre-compiled JavaScript that does only fraction of the work now. Because on the server, they can figure a lot of things out and produce completely different JavaScript looking at your JavaScript. So this is called AOT, and the build, ng build, I think build, will do that. It will compile. So instead of distributing your JavaScript, you distribute in the compilation results JavaScript. If you open it in like Studio or Notepad or whatever else, you won't recognize most of your code. It's completely different. It's completely rewritten. One of the reasons they can do it is because it's TypeScript. So it's a lot more semantic, and they can make more educated decisions about how to replace things and also how to do tree shaking. So it was really hard before to do that kind of things because the tools didn't have enough context. But Angular 2 has a lot of context, and API is designed such a way to support that ahead of time compilation. So like ng module, the way it's designed is to support ahead of time compilation. Because technically, it wasn't needed. And it didn't even exist until like August. Wasn't part of the framework. But this ahead of time compilation speeds up your app startup time and even runtime. Because as you navigate, create your new component, that's faster too. Because your new component is pre-compiled.
So is this something you got to handle with Gulp?
It's up to you. I use Gulp just because I've used Gulp for a long time, but you don't have to.
Okay. But it is an additional step after the TypeScript.
It is an additional step after TypeScript to JavaScript compilation.
Okay.
So you would launch your ng CLI,
Right.
and you can do it through Gulp and do like a file monitor and say when the JS file changes, run that.
Okay.
So you can monitor for any JS file and
So
just
you could include
build.
that in your
Yeah, you can
net
include
monitor, when you, in that process that you did earlier when you were changing files and the circle was restarting.
It's similar thing.
Yeah. Okay.
You can do that too, because in core projects, there is a concept of test runner, which is like typically a node test run. So you can create that and set it up as post build event in project.json. And anytime project is compiled, it can kick off a node task automatically. So you can do it without Gulp if you want. There is definitely a flow for that. And it also supports a linting, which I didn't mention, which is the thing. So ASP.NET Core also has a CLI. We saw things like EF commands in there and .NET Watch Run command. Those are part of it. It also supports NuGeting, which is look at your project JSON and pull down all the NuGet packages. So it does like NuGet restore. .NET restore will restore NuGet packages. So it does run, and you can do build, and you can do some very basic scaffolding, but not a whole lot. Developing, Mac or Windows, either one works. Almost any decent editor or IDE supports TypeScript. And because Angular 2 is written in TypeScript, by extension, it supports Angular 2. And just name an editor, it supports TypeScript at this point. Anyway, on Mac or on Windows. And all the projects are on GitHub if you want to follow and keep up with the releases. There are many blogs and such. And I covered very, very small part of that, of what Angular 2 and Web API do. And it took 2 hours. My video course is like 8 hours. And it does not go all that deep either. Just to give you the perspective of how much there is to learn. Hence, I call this session primer. You're not going to learn like a ton, but hopefully you will know how to get started, and at a high level, how to write that code. And I'm going to post the slides and the project and email Jeff the link. That may be Saturday before that happens, but I will do that. And I will post the video on YouTube if anybody cares to watch it again. So we're going to wrap it up and going to do final round of questions, and then we're just going to go home and get some sleep. No questions, and I'm going to stop 2 hours, 19 minutes.